The veteran's last wish. Some scars are invisible to the naked eye, but they cut deeper than any blade. And sometimes in the bright lights of a television studio, the most unexpected healing begins. The Family Feud stage gleamed under its familiar cascade of blue and gold lights, the iconic logo shining like a beacon of American entertainment. Steve Harvey stood at center stage in his immaculate navy suit, his megawatt smile working the crowd with the effortless charm that had made him a household name across the country. It was a typical Tuesday afternoon taping in Los Angeles. The energy was electric. The audience was primed, and two families stood ready to battle for the grand prize. On the left, the Martinez family from Phoenix, Arizona, 5 generations of teachers and small business owners who had driven 12 hours to be there. On the right, the Carter family from rural Tennessee, farmers and mechanics who had never been on an airplane before this moment. But this story isn't about either of those families. This story is about the man standing third from the left at the Carter family podium, wearing a button-down shirt that was slightly too big for his lean frame, his hands clasped behind his back in a posture that spoke of military discipline even in civilian clothes. Sergeant First Class David Carter, 28 years old, had been home from Afghanistan for exactly 14 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days. Not that he was counting. The physical wounds had healed. The shrapnel scars on his left shoulder barely showed anymore. The limp from his injured leg was almost imperceptible now. To anyone watching the show, David looked like a typical young father, clean-cut, respectful, standing proudly with his family as they prepared to compete on America's favorite game show. What they couldn't see was the war that still raged inside his mind every single day. David had enlisted at 18, driven by the same patriotic fervor that had called young men to service for generations. He'd served 3 tours in Afghanistan, leading a squad of 12 soldiers through some of the most dangerous territory in the world. He'd brought 11 of them home safely. The one who didn't make it home was Private James Rodriguez, 19 years old, from a small town outside San Antonio. Jimmy, as his squad called him, had been 3 weeks away from rotating back to the States when his vehicle hit an improvised explosive device on a routine patrol outside Kandahar. David had been in the vehicle behind Jimmy's. He'd been the first to reach the wreckage. He'd held Jimmy's hand as the life faded from his eyes, promising him that he'd make it home, that he'd tell Jimmy's family how brave he'd been, how much he'd meant to everyone who served with him. But the promise David had made to Jimmy's mother at the funeral had proven more difficult to keep than any mission he'd ever undertaken in Afghanistan. He'd promised her that Jimmy's sacrifice would have meaning, that David would come home and live the life that Jimmy never got the chance to live. The problem was, David had forgotten how to live. Post-traumatic stress disorder was the clinical term the doctors used. PTSD. 3 letters that somehow were supposed to explain why David jumped at the sound of car doors slamming, why he couldn't sleep without the television on, why crowded spaces made him feel like he was suffocating. But the worst part, the part that kept him awake at night, was what it had done to his relationship with his daughter. Emma Carter was 7 years old, with pigtails and gap-toothed smile that could light up any room she entered. Before David's deployment, she had been his shadow, following him everywhere, begging him to read her stories and play tea party with her stuffed animal. She'd wrap her tiny arms around his neck and whisper, "I love you, Daddy," in his ear like it was the most important secret in the world. But when David came home, something had changed. Not in Emma. She was still the same bright, loving child she'd always been. The change was in David. He couldn't touch her. It wasn't that he didn't want to. God, how he wanted to hold his daughter, to feel her small hand in his, to experience that pure, uncomplicated love that only a child can give. But every time he tried, every time he reached for her, his hands would shake, his heart would race. Images from Afghanistan would flash through his mind, images of other children, children who had been caught in the crossfire of a war they didn't understand. What if he hurt her? What if the rage and violence that lived inside him now somehow infected the one person in the world he loved more than life itself? What if his damaged mind and damaged hands weren't safe for something as precious and fragile as his daughter's trust? So David had made the cruelest decision of his life. He'd chosen to love Emma from a distance. He lived in the same house, ate meals at the same table, watched her grow and learn and become more amazing every day. But he hadn't touched her in 3 years. Not a hug, not a kiss on the forehead, not even a high five when she brought home a perfect spelling test. Emma had stopped asking why Daddy didn't want to hug her anymore. That might have been the most heartbreaking part of all. David's wife, Lisa, had tried everything: counseling, medication, support groups for military families. She'd been patient and understanding, and stronger than any person should have to be. But David could see the toll it was taking on their marriage, on their family. He could see the way Emma sometimes looked at other fathers picking up their daughters at school, the longing in her eyes for the kind of physical affection she remembered, but could no longer have. The Family Feud application had been Lisa's idea. She'd thought maybe being on television, doing something fun and light-hearted as a family, might help David remember what joy felt like. The show had accepted their application based on their compelling backstory, a military family adjusting to life after deployment. But the producers had no idea how deep the real story ran. Now, standing on that bright stage with cameras rolling and an audience cheering, David felt like he was wearing a mask. He smiled when Steve Harvey made jokes. He celebrated when his family gave good answers. He played the part of the proud father and devoted husband. But inside, he was drowning. The game had progressed normally through the first 3 rounds. The Carter family was holding their own against the Martinez family, with David's mother providing some surprisingly savvy answers, and his teenage nephew bringing down the house with his knowledge of social media trends. Steve was in his element, working the crowd and creating those moments of connection that made Family Feud more than just a game show. He'd spent extra time talking to David during the family introductions, thanking him for his service, and making sure the audience understood they were in the presence of a genuine American hero. David had accepted the praise with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else, but Steve had noticed something in the veteran's eyes, something that went beyond the usual nervousness of being on television. A kind of deep sadness that seemed at odds with the celebration happening around him. Now, as they entered the 4th round, Steve announced the category that would change everything. "All right, Carter family," Steve said, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had endeared him to millions of viewers. "This one's for you. Top 6 answers on the board." The studio lights seemed to intensify as Steve opened his card, and David felt a familiar tightness in his chest. The bright lights always reminded him of the searchlights they'd used on night patrols in Afghanistan. "We asked 100 people," Steve announced. "When is the last time a father remembers hugging his child?" It was such an innocent question, such a normal Family Feud question, the kind of thing that usually generated answers like bedtime, or when they were sad, or before school. The kind of question that should have brought smiles and warm memories and maybe a few chuckles from the audience. But for David Carter, it was like being shot all over again. The studio seemed to tilt around him. His vision blurred slightly around the edges. His hands began to shake. He clasped them tighter behind his back, hoping no one would notice. David's mother stepped up to the buzzer first, her face bright with confidence. "Before bedtime," she announced cheerfully. "Before bedtime," Steve repeated. "Good answer. Survey says." The board lit up. Number 1 answer, worth 31 points. The Carter family cheered, and David forced himself to smile and clap along with them. His nephew went next. When they got hurt, he called out, and again the board responded positively. Number 3. They were doing well, really well. All they needed was a few more answers to control the board and play for the points. It should have been a moment of family triumph, but as the round continued, each answer felt like another weight pressing down on David's chest. When they were scared, number 4. When they accomplished something, number 6. When they said goodbye, number 2. Each answer was a reminder of moments David hadn't shared with Emma. Bedtimes where he stood in the doorway watching Lisa tuck their daughter in. Scraped knees he'd watched Lisa bandage while he kept his distance. School performances where he'd clap from the audience, but couldn't bring himself to congratulate Emma with the hug she deserved. When his turn came, David approached the buzzer like he was walking toward enemy fire. His military training kicked in, and he forced his breathing to remain steady, his posture to stay strong. But inside, he was falling apart. "David, my man," Steve said, and something in the host's voice was different now. Gentler, more personal. "What you thinking? When does a father remember the last time he hugged his child?" David stared at the board, but the words were blurring together. His throat felt like it was closing. In his mind, he could see Emma's face, the last time he'd held her. She'd been 4 years old, running to greet him at the airport when he came home on leave. She'd thrown herself into his arms with such pure joy, such absolute trust, and he'd spun her around while she giggled and told him how much she'd missed him. That was the last time. 3 years, 4 months, and 16 days ago. Not that he was counting. "The day they left for war," David said quietly, his voice barely audible over the studio's ambient noise. Steve's expression shifted. The game show host had been expecting a typical answer, something light, something that would keep the energy up, and the game moving. But something in David's tone, something in the way he delivered that answer, made Steve pause. "The day they left for war," Steve repeated slowly. "Survey says." The answer wasn't on the board. Normally this would be the moment for Steve to console the contestant. Maybe make a gentle joke and move on to the opposing family. Instead, Steve found himself walking closer to David. "Son," Steve said, his voice dropping to a level that was barely picked up by the microphones. "You all right?" That's when David broke. 3 years of bottled-up pain, 3 years of forcing himself to be strong, 3 years of loving his daughter from a distance because he was too broken to trust himself with her heart. It all came pouring out in a moment of devastating honesty. "I can't touch her," David whispered, his voice cracking. "I haven't hugged my daughter in 3 years because I'm afraid I'll hurt her. I'm afraid that everything that's wrong with me will somehow damage the most perfect thing in my life." The studio didn't go silent immediately. The audience was still processing what they'd heard. The Martinez family was still standing at their podium, and the cameras were capturing what seemed like a routine moment between host and contestant. But Steve Harvey had been doing this long enough to recognize when something real was happening. More than that, Steve Harvey was a father himself. He understood, in that instant, the depth of pain behind David's confession. "Hold on," Steve said, raising his hand to signal the production team. "Hold on, just to end it here." The studio began to quiet. The Martinez family stopped conferring about their potential answers. Even the cameraman seemed to sense that something significant was happening. Steve set down his cards and walked around his podium to stand directly in front of David. When he spoke, his voice had lost all traces of performance. This was no longer Steve Harvey the entertainer. This was Steve Harvey the father, the man who understood that some conversations matter more than television. "David," he said softly, "look at me, son." David raised his eyes to meet Steve's, and what the host saw there nearly broke his heart. It was pain so deep and profound that it seemed to radiate from the young veteran like heat from a flame. "How long since you've been able to touch your little girl?" Steve asked gently. 3 years, David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not since I came back. I keep thinking about all the children in Afghanistan. All the kids who got caught up in things they didn't understand. What if I can't tell the difference anymore? What if I hurt her?" Behind the scenes, producers were frantically whispering into their headsets, trying to figure out how to handle this unprecedented moment. But Steve wasn't looking at them. He wasn't thinking about schedules or ratings or television protocols. He was looking at a father in pain and a little girl who was watching from the audience. Because Emma Carter was there. Lisa had brought her to watch Daddy on television, and she was sitting in the 3rd row, wearing a yellow dress and clutching a small American flag. She didn't fully understand what was happening on stage, but she could see that her father was sad and that the nice man in the suit was trying to help him. "Emma," Steve called out, his voice carrying across the studio. "Emma Carter, sweetheart. Can you come up here for a minute?" Lisa looked uncertain, but something in Steve's expression, the absolute certainty that this was the right thing to do, convinced her to let Emma go. The little girl walked onto the stage with the careful steps of someone who knows they're in an important place. She approached her father and Steve, her big eyes taking in everything around her. "Hi, Daddy," she said simply, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. David looked down at his daughter, and for a moment, everyone in the studio could see his heart breaking and mending at the same time. "Hi, baby," he whispered. Steve knelt down so he was at Emma's eye level. "Emma, sweetheart, your daddy is a hero. Did you know that?" Emma nodded solemnly. "He fought the bad guys in Afghanistan." "That's right," Steve said. "And sometimes, when people fight the bad guys, they get a little scared that they might accidentally hurt the good guys. Even the people they love the most in the whole world." Emma considered this with the serious expression of a child trying to understand adult problems. "But Daddy would never hurt me," she said, with absolute certainty. "He loves me." Steve looked up at David, whose eyes were now filled with tears. "You hear that, soldier?" Steve said softly. "Your daughter knows who you are. She knows your heart." What happened next was the kind of moment that television was invented to capture. Not because it was scripted or planned, but because it was purely devastatingly real. Steve stood up and placed one hand on David's shoulder. "David," he said, "I want you to listen to me very carefully. What you experienced over there, what you've been carrying, that's not who you are. That's what happened to you. There's a difference." The veteran looked at Steve, and for the first time in 3 years, he allowed himself to hope. "Your daughter has been waiting for her daddy to come home," Steve continued. "Not just from Afghanistan, from whatever prison you've been keeping yourself in since you got back. She doesn't need you to be perfect. She needs you to be present." Steve gestured to Emma, who was standing patiently beside them, still holding her little flag. "Look at her, David. Really look at her. Does she look afraid of you?" David looked down at Emma, and what he saw was not fear or uncertainty. He saw love. Pure, uncomplicated, 7-year-old love that didn't care about PTSD or Afghanistan, or any of the reasons he'd convinced himself he was too broken to be her father. "Daddy," Emma said, her voice small but clear, "why don't you hug me anymore? Did I do something wrong?" The question hit David like a physical blow. All this time he'd been so focused on protecting Emma from his damage that he'd never considered how his distance might be hurting her. "No, baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't do anything wrong, Daddy got scared." "Of me?" Emma asked, her eyes wide. "No," David said quickly. "Never of you. I was scared that I might hurt you because sometimes my brain gets confused about where I am and what's happening around me." Emma thought about this for a moment, then reached up and took her father's hand. The contact was electric. David's first instinct was to pull away, but Emma's small fingers were surprisingly strong and she held on. "Does it hurt now?" she asked, looking up at him with those enormous brown eyes. David stared down at their joined hands. No flashbacks, no panic, no images of Afghanistan. Just his daughter's warm, soft hand and his— "No," he whispered, wonder creeping into his voice. "It doesn't hurt." Steve smiled, recognizing the moment for what it was. "That's because love is stronger than fear, son. Always has been. Always will be." What happened next was the kind of moment that changes lives. David knelt down in front of Emma, bringing himself to her level. With trembling hands, he reached out and cupped her face gently. "I'm sorry, baby girl," he said, tears streaming down his face now. "I'm so sorry. I've been afraid to show you how much I love you." "It's okay, Daddy," Emma said solemnly. "You can hug me now if you want." David looked into his daughter's eyes, eyes that held no judgment, no resentment, only love and forgiveness and the infinite patience of a child who has been waiting for her father to find his way home. "I would like that very much," he whispered. The hug that followed was 3 years in the making. David wrapped his arms around his daughter and held her against his chest, feeling her heartbeat, breathing in the scent of her shampoo, marveling at how perfectly she fit in his arms. Emma hugged him back with the fierce intensity of a child who has finally gotten what she's been waiting for. She buried her face in his shoulder and whispered, "I missed you, Daddy." "I missed you too, baby," David replied. "I missed you so much." The studio audience rose to their feet in spontaneous applause, but it wasn't the usual game show cheering. It was the sound of people witnessing something sacred, something that reminded them of the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. Steve let the moment continue for as long as it needed to, understanding that some things are more important than television schedules. When father and daughter finally separated, Emma remained close to David, holding his hand and smiling up at him like he'd just performed a miracle. In a way, he had. "Ladies and gentlemen," Steve announced to the studio and to the millions of viewers who would later watch this moment, "what we just witnessed here today is more important than any game show. This is about healing. This is about family. This is about what happens when love finally wins over fear." He turned to address David directly. "Son, you've been carrying the weight of war for 3 years, but you don't have to carry it alone anymore. Your family is here. Your daughter needs her father, not a perfect father, just a present one." Steve reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his personal business card. "I want you to have this," he said, placing it in David's free hand. "That's my direct number. And I want you to call me if you ever feel like you're losing this battle again. Because what happened here today, this is just the beginning of your healing, not the end." David looked at the card, then at Steve, then at Emma, who was still beaming up at him. "Thank you," he said simply. But the two words carried the weight of 3 years of gratitude. Steve smiled and turned to the audience. "The game doesn't matter anymore," he announced. "Both families are winners today. But more than that, we all just learned something about what it means to come home from war." He paused, letting the gravity of the moment settle over the studio. "David Carter served our country with honor and courage. But the bravest thing he did wasn't in Afghanistan. It was right here, right now, when he chose to trust in love again." The cameras captured every moment as David and Emma walked hand in hand back to the Carter family podium, where Lisa is waiting with tears in her eyes and arms open wide. The family embraced as one, and for the first time in 3 years, David allowed himself to be fully present for it. The episode aired exactly as it happened, with no editing to minimize the emotional impact. The response was immediate and overwhelming. The show received over 200,000 messages from viewers, many of them veterans sharing their own stories of coming home and struggling to reconnect with their families. More importantly, the episode sparked a national conversation about PTSD and the challenges facing military families. Donations to veteran support organizations increased dramatically in the weeks following the broadcast. David started therapy the following week, but this time he wasn't going alone. Emma accompanied him to several sessions, helping him work through his fears about being a father again. The therapist was amazed at how quickly David's symptoms improved once he allowed himself to reconnect physically with his daughter. 6 months later, Steve received a photo in the mail. It showed David pushing Emma on a swing set in their backyard, both of them laughing. On the back, David had written, "Thank you for helping me remember that the best part of coming home from war is being able to hold the people you fought to protect." Emma kept a photo from that day, too. The moment when her father knelt down and hugged her for the first time in 3 years. She carried it in her backpack to school, showing it to anyone who would listen, and telling them about the day her daddy stopped being scared. But perhaps the most profound change was in the way David understood his service. For 3 years he'd carried Jimmy Rodriguez's death as a burden, a reminder of his failure to bring everyone home safely. But in that moment on the Family Feud stage, holding his daughter and feeling her love wash over him, David finally understood what Jimmy would have wanted. Jimmy would have wanted David to live, to love, to be present for the life he'd been given, and the family who needed him. The war in Afghanistan was over for David Carter. But the war for his family, for his healing, for his future, that was a battle he was finally ready to win. Steve Harvey kept his promise too. He checked in with the Carter family regularly, celebrating milestones and offering support during difficult moments. When Emma graduated from high school years later, Steve was there in the audience, watching as David hugged his daughter and told her how proud he was. Because that's what happens when someone chooses courage over fear, connection over isolation, love over the stories we tell ourselves about why we're not worthy of happiness. David Carter came home from war twice, once when his plane landed, and once when he finally allowed himself to hold his daughter again. The second homecoming was the one that saved them both. Disclaimer: this content is a dramatized narrative created for educational and inspirational purposes. While inspired by real challenges faced by military veterans and their families, including PTSD and reintegration difficulties, the specific events and dialogue are fictional. The story is designed to entertain, inspire, and encourage understanding and support for veterans and military families. Any resemblance to actual persons or events is purely coincidental.